Shalom. This week we are reading Parashat Lech Lecha. And now we meet Avraham Avinu. At this point in the beginning of our Parasha, still called Avram. And Avraham, the patriarch of the nation of Israel, enters onto the stage of history in this Parasha. We just briefly were introduced to him in the genealogy at the end of last week's Parashat Noach. And there's so much that's happening in this week's Torah portion, the war of the kings that Avraham finds himself involved in, the covenant between the portions, the changing of Avram's name to Avraham. And there's so much that we learn in our tradition about the nature of this giant of people, this true spiritual seeker. Perhaps we could really call him the father of all true spiritual seekers. He lived in a world that was totally debased and sunken in all sorts of vile practices. There was no truth. There was no one for him to learn from, and our sages emphasized the fact that he was so totally consumed with his desire for the truth, his desire to know the nature of the universe and the answer to his questions about who brought forth all of creation. He was so totally consumed by this that indeed Hashem himself appeared to him. So the background of the entrance onto the stage of world history of Avram, the background is a world that was just mad, even after all the generations, even after the flood, after the tower, the dispersion. We're still dealing with a world of manipulative, cynical, exploitive, special interest groups of people that were controlling others, that were only out for their own power. And so the conception of a God that all of these heathen nations had was something that they actually cast in their own image. And so Avraham lived in a world where there was a God associated with everything, with every sort of natural phenomena, with every sort of primal dark fear that a person could have, a God to ward off every sort of calamity, and a God to bring every sort of calamity. And all these gods were clashing, and you bang a gong to bring out this type of God, and you knock on a tree to summon this type of God. And what a total mixed up confusion situation that he found himself confronting. He got no help from his father. He had no master or instructor to guide him. So it was his own power of sincerity and his own hunger for truth that drove him, and through which he merited to a true revelation. But what was that revelation? Was it mystical? Was it something that could be ascribed to some sort of dream, to some sort of fantasy? There's so much going on in this Torah portion. Again, the covenant between the portions, that whole prophetic scenario, the war of the kings, so difficult to understand Avraham's involvement, the change of his name. But I'd like to focus on the beginning of this Torah portion, on the whole concept that is signified by the words Lech Lecha, which of course translated commonly understood to mean go for yourself, for your own benefit, but which we understand on a deeper level also means Lech Lecha, really travel, go into yourself. And apparently that's exactly what Avraham did, and he found the answers to his question of the nature of the universe and the reality of God within himself. And it was this level of self-knowledge that brought him to a greater level of a universal type of revelation. So at the beginning of our Parsha, again, the background that our sages tell us about the years of Avraham's incredible journey, his odyssey, his his selfless and bold and brave campaign in the face of persecution and near death to take a stand for the truth. This brought him to the level of Hashem revealing himself to him. Hashem said to Avraham, go for yourself, or into yourself, from your land, from your relatives, and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. So give up everything that you've ever known. This isn't where it is for you. There's nothing here for you. Now we have found each other. God is really saying, and I'm going to bring you to the place where you will be able to plug in to the potential that you have found, and we will be able to map out a destiny for the rest of time, for all of humanity, through you, because you're the one that has found me. Nobody was looking until now. And so I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And this is interesting because everyone else is always looking to be blessed. And Hashem says to Avram, you will be the blessing. So he begins his journey, and he takes his wife, he takes his family, and they go to the land of Canaan. They came to the land of Canaan, and Hashem appeared to Avram and told him, first of the promises relating to the land, to your offspring, I will give this land. So you're in the right place now. This is the land. And so he built an altar there to Hashem, who appeared to him, and from there he continued journeying. And then suddenly in verse 10, we read that there was a famine in the land, and Avram descended to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. There's really two questions that I'd like to ask about what we're about to read. First of all, where do we find a command recorded here by Torah that Hashem commanded Avram to descend into Egypt? It seems that Avram decided that it was time for him to leave this land that Hashem promised to him and his children, and to go down to Egypt to search for food. Doesn't that seem a little bit strange regarding the man who found God, the man who is the one true knower of the reality of God? And so many verses in the Torah from Ezekiel and from Isaiah and from Psalms indicate the tremendous intimacy, the high level of the preciousness of the relationship between God and Avraham. He called Avraham my friend. He called Avraham the citizen of the world. Avraham changed everything for all time, for all people, because he was so dedicated to God. And this is after many, many years of self-sacrifice and of tremendous hard work to find God. It seems like now Avraham is confronted with his first test of faith. There's a famine in the land, and he goes down to Egypt. Doesn't this seem a little strange? What happened to basic belief that everything will be for the best, that, God will provide, and all the kind of watchwords that we're all so familiar with, that we parrot all the time? We certainly would expect Avraham Avinu, Abraham, our patriarch, to be able to teach us some of these things that we all aspire to: faith in God, trust. It seems that the first sign of any sort of problem, he is out of there, and he's going down to Egypt. And second of all, what's with this rather bizarre behavior once he gets there regarding his wife, the decision to present things not as they are, his concern about, it seems, his own welfare, and the complicity, the program of presenting Sarah not as his wife. How do we explain these details of our story. I think that actually we have here a very profound insight into one of the most basic principles of Torah. And actually, I think that this whole idea of Avram's descent into Egypt and his behavior there is indicative of the greatness, the power of his relationship with God. I think it teaches us a great deal about the God of Avraham, as opposed to all those other gods in that whole pantheon of those that would come at the bang of a gong or the knock on a tree or a whistle, and all those conflicting powers that existed in the mindset of the heathens that Avraham really waged war against his entire life. Avraham was not relying on a miracle. Avraham was not dealing with a set of core beliefs or metaphysics or anything at all that was outside of his control. Avraham was a realist. Today, when we look at the story, we can ask ourselves all sorts of questions based on time-honored principles that have come down to us from our sages, such as the belief that Hashem will provide, etc., etc. But there's another concept, and that is that one does not rely on a miracle. The God of Avraham is the God of this world, and the God that Avraham began to perceive and appreciate and fathom and understand so well his relationship with the universe is the God that is described to us in the Torah, who his basic approach to us is that we must take responsibility for ourselves, for our own actions, that we live in a world wherein we are judged by the decisions that we make, where we have free choice, where we must assume ultimate responsibility for everything. And Avraham was not waiting for a miracle. Avraham passed this test of faith because this is precisely the nature of the proper relationship with God. Yes, he just brought him to this land that he promised to him and to his generations. And yes, he told him that he will be the source of blessing for the entire world. But what is that blessing? And what is that relationship? The blessing comes from the role that we take as human beings, the active role that we take in our own destiny. Avraham was not waiting for God to feed him in some miraculous manner in the midst of a terrible famine. Avraham knew that he was responsible for himself, for his family, and this is the God that he knew, the God of this world, who expects him to be able to rise to any challenge and pass the test. And Avraham, who was such a great theologian, who was such a great philosopher, who was such a deep thinker, such a spiritual seeker, one thing that we know about him and the world that he lived in and the world that he came from is that he knew people. He knew people very well. He knew exactly who was who and what makes people tick, and apparently how to deal with people. And he was a master communicator, and he was a great psychoanalyst, and he understood the people of his generation, and he understood full well what could happen to his wife as a married woman in Egypt. And rather than be concerned about himself, as a superficial reading might indicate, he was really concerned about her and what would happen to her if it was perceived that she was married and that the husband was in the way, whereas if he was perceived as being her brother, it would be possible to navigate through the situation. All in all, this first introduction that we have to the character of Avram, to become Avraham, the father of the Jewish people, is indicative of such a basic principle of Torah philosophy, psychology, and approach to life. Hashem is in the world, Hashem is guiding our lives, and we are responsible to Him to be in the driver's seat, to make the right decisions, to assume responsibility, not to expect some supernatural or otherworldly intervention, but to be ready to face any challenge and any crisis with our own logic, with our own rational approach, with our understanding that God expects us to be cognizant of the reality and to take control of the situation. This was the guiding light of his sojourning in Egypt, realizing that Hashem is expecting him to respond, to make the right decision, to persevere, to safeguard himself and his family, to safeguard his wife, and as opposed to this being misunderstood as a lack of faith or as some sort of failure to understand the dynamic of his relationship with God, this is the greatest indication of Avraham's perception of what Torah expects from us in this world, truly as children of God, as subjects of the King. The knowledge that he brought of this great God, the only true reality of the world, so differs from the mindset of the minuscule, pagan, self-serving, self-projected imagery that was so rampant in his world of all the various sundry powers that controlled every whim and reaction of the denizens of this world. His was a one controlling God who sought and who seeks the benefit of all mankind, but who requires man constantly, consistently, and without exception to take the active role and to show that he will be responsible for his own future. And this is the source of the blessing that Avraham brings to the world, the knowledge that the fate of humanity, the fate of this world, our own fate, is so much largely dependent upon the decisions that we make for Hashem in this world, who looks and sees that we have indeed risen to the occasion and that we are willing to take responsibility, like Avraham, as citizens in this world.